Hi, we're going to be working on problem CP4-1 on page 191, but I've changed it a bit because I've added this dividends account here for $3,000, and I took away $3,000 from the salaries and wages expense because I wanted to demonstrate how to do closing journal entries for dividends. What I've done on your worksheet is to put in there all the account balances that are in the debit and credit columns there so that you don't have to do that as step one, and to speed things a little bit along for this demo. So what we're focusing in on this problem are the closing entries. The last step of the accounting cycle is called the closing process, and this is performed only at the end of the year after you've finished preparing all of your financial statements. The closing process cleans up the accounting records and gets them ready to begin tracking revenues, expenses, and dividends for the next accounting year. In Chapter 3, we said to think of revenue and expense accounts like subcategories of retained earnings, which are used to track earnings-related transactions of the current year. The dividends account is also used similarly to track dividends declared during the current year. At the end of the year, after all the year's transactions and adjustments are recorded, all revenue, expense, and dividend accounts are closed or zeroed out by moving their balances to their permanent home in retained earnings. Now, revenues, expenses, and dividends are temporary accounts. They're used to track only the current year's activities and results, and then they are closed or zeroed out before the next year's activities are recorded. So we've got two purposes here in the closing process. The first is we're going to transfer the net income or loss and dividends into the retained earnings account. And secondly, we're going to establish a zero balance in all the income statement and dividends account. In other words, revenues, expenses, and dividends. What we've got in front of us is Rollcom Inc.'s adjusted trial balance. Now the financial statements have already been prepared, and what we see are all the account balances on the adjusted trial balance and indeed the totals due balance. Our first step in doing our closing journal entries is to close out the revenue accounts. We're going to debit each revenue account for the amount of its credit balance, credit each expense account for the amount of its debit balance, and then record the difference in retained earnings. And if we've done it correctly, the amount credited to retained earnings should equal the net income on the income statement. So let's start by debiting sales revenue here. And the amount is $325,600. Now we're going to credit or do the opposite to all the expense accounts. Sorry. I'll tab in there. $125,007. Now the next expense is rent expense. It has a debit balance. We're going to do the opposite. And that's $164,200. And then office expense has a debit balance of $6,300. We're going to credit, do the opposite. Finally, the last expense is income tax expense. It has a debit balance. Again, we do the opposite. We're going to credit. $10,500. Now we're going to add up all the debits, add up all the credits, and subtract. So the credits total $306,700. So the debits are $325,600. The credits total $306,700. Subtract, and then put the difference on the smaller side. In other words, the side that has less in it, in this case the credit side. The difference is $18,900, and we're going to credit the retained earnings account. That's where we put our net income. And I'll put the numbers here so that you can see the totals. You wouldn't have to do that on the journal entry, but that way you get the idea. Now we're going to close out the dividends account. The dividends account has a debit balance of $3,000. If we want to make that account zero, we need to do the opposite or credit it for $3,000. So I'm going to credit that and debit retained earnings for $3,000. Oh dear, sorry. And that will zero out our dividends account. So we've done our two steps here. We've closed out the revenues, expenses, and dividends account and reduced their balances to zero in the process of creating these closing journal entries. And we've also transferred the balance of those accounts, in other words, the net income, revenues minus expenses, into retained earnings. And we've reduced retained earnings by the amount of the dividends, just as in the statement of retained earnings. Okay, now it would be time to post our closing journal entries into the T accounts, which I've provided on the next page. Now I have pre-posted these just to make things go a little more quickly for you on this demonstration. Everything that you see CJE by is a posting from the closing journal entry above. So for example, sales revenue, a debit of $325,600 is posted here. Salaries and wages, $125,700 is posted to the credit side of the salaries and wages expense account. Okay. Now as we look at each of our revenue and expense accounts and our dividends account, you'll notice that when we go to calculate the balance, and the way we calculate the balance is to add up the debits, add up the credits, and then subtract. As we go to calculate those balances, the balances are zero. $325,600 minus $325,600 yields a zero balance. The same thing with salaries and wages, $125,700. Debits minus $125,700 credits equals zero. The same thing with rent expense, office expense, income tax expense, and dividends. The retained earnings account is different, however. We started with $99,900, but our closing journal entries transferred $18,900 of net income, the difference between revenues and expenses, into retained earnings, and then we reduced retained earnings by the amount of dividends, the earnings that have been distributed to stockholders. So our ending balance in retained earnings is $115,800. Retained earnings is not a temporary account like revenues, expenses, and dividends. It's a permanent account whose balance carries forward to the next period. The last step of this problem is to prepare a post-closing, after closing, trial balance to make certain that the balances in the accounts, the amounts of the accounts and debit balances equal the amounts of the accounts and credit balances. Now, most of the account balances will not change. The assets, liabilities, common stock account will not change. These balances will all remain the same. So again, I have pre-posted them for you here. They remain the same as the top. But as we enter our revenues and expenses, those accounts no longer have a balance. They're zero balance. They have a zero balance. Let's enter in retained earnings because that's the next account, the equity account, $115,800. And then as we enter in our revenues and expenses, we'll just put a zero. Or in connect, I believe you may be able to leave those blank. You can check your, sorry, I meant to put that on the right side. You can use a check my work if you'd like. So the expense account also had a zero balance. Revenues were zero. Salaries and wages are 0. Rent expense, office expense, income tax expense, and dividends all have a 0 balance. Oh, and I did forget the dividends account as well. Should be up after retained earnings. Okay. Now if we total down, let's see, make sure I've got 4 expense accounts. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the dividends. And we've got our sales revenue account at 0. Now we should total down, and the accounts with debit balances should equal the accounts with credit balances. So that if I add down all my debits, the total should be $272,700. Wow, I'm not typing well today at all, am I? And if I add down my accounts with credit balances, I should also equal $272,700. And what we've just done, proving debit credit accuracy, ensures that we start the next period with balances in our assets, liabilities, and equity accounts that are correct, and that we have no revenues, expenses, or dividend account balances, which is what we're looking for. And this is the very last step in the accounting cycle. We only do our closing journal entries and a post-closing trial balance at year end. Remember, I did modify this problem. You're going to have a similar problem for homework, but I did modify this problem, adding T accounts, and I pre-posted the account balances for you in the adjusted trial balance. I also added a dividends account so I can show you how to close the dividends account as well. So I did alter that a bit. Please don't let that throw you off, but feel free to call me or send me a T-Wolves email message if you have any questions. Good luck with the homework.